interest in a social history of, in general, technology, but more specifically in a social history of music and experimental music, which is more my territory. And so I have audio examples, I have a number of visual elements to illustrate what I'm going to present to you, and I have also a number of different options. I am interested in discussing a few core ideas, a few essential ideas that have to do not only with my work, but have to do, I believe, with the work of many other people. In fact, probably hundreds of thousands of people worldwide. So I think the questions, the main questions, affect a lot of people, and they affect the work they do in terms of creation, in terms of composition, in terms of what we consider to be music, or what we consider to be not music, or sound art. So there's many different elements and many different possibilities. I'm of course interested that we have time for discussion and questions. And so this is a combination of talk, discussion, whatever you want to call it, and partly also listening session, because I have many different examples, as I said before. So I'll do my best to illustrate all of these different ideas, and I am interested in discussing some of the ideas that I will present to you. In fact, I am more interested in doing work, creation work, compositional work. But I'm also interested in thinking about these questions and the consequences of what we think about creation, about what we think about what it is to record sound or create music with sound, or do whatever we want to do with extractions from reality, sounds or images. I'm interested in those questions in general, and so I'm interested in discussing those ideas. I guess I need to perhaps start with an introduction about what I do. I have been working with sound and what some people will consider to be music for more than 30 years now, and specifically in the type of universe of working with sound that I will show to you. But instead of telling you a number of possible stories about myself, I prefer to put that into a larger context. When I started working with sound recordings and music around the late 70s, early 80s, I worked with, for almost 10 years, for almost the entire decade of the 80s, I worked almost exclusively with cassette recorders and with tape cassette technology to do what I was doing at the time. Basically recording sounds of many different kinds in my immediate environment. I'm originally from Spain, from Madrid. So in my environment at the time, in my city and in the countryside around it, wherever I could go, I was doing recordings of many different things. I was exploring the world through recordings somehow. And of course, many other people were doing this since the invention of the tape machines, and particularly since the development and the marketing of that thing of the past, the cassette tape. The cassette tape was a development in a long history of recording technology that started not only with the phonograph, but also started with other machines in the 19th century, in the late 19th century, other machines that also recorded on with magnetism. The phonograph is the first machine that was invented to record sound, as we all know, and it was a mechanical machine. It was a machine that transformed vibrations of the air, well, encoded somehow in material form, vibrations of air into first cylinders and then gramophone records. And but at the same time, in the late 19th century, other machines were recording sound through magnetic means. And that's a long story that I'm not going to go into now. But the sort of the end of that story by the end of the 20th century, around the 70s, was, or the manifestation at the time, was the cassette tape. So what is, to me, interesting about the cassette tape is not the technology itself, but the techno-cultural complex. That is a combination of the technology with the culture and with the environment and with the society that was exposed to it and the society that I was using this technology. So I am not a nostalgic kind of person, as some of the people are. For example, now cassettes have come back, and there is some, of course, in a very underground way. To me, this is more like this resurrection is somehow a zombie kind of resurrection, but they have resurrected somehow in a small scale, in a very small underground environment, and part of the explanation for this, if not almost everything that will explain something like this to happening, is probably nostalgia. And for younger people, it's nostalgia of a life that they didn't live, or something like that, which is common. It's a very common form of nostalgia. And I have nothing against that. On the contrary, I think that's good and that's positive. But this is not what I'm driven by in my work. The thing is that the cassette made possible something of a small revolution in the world of music and in the world of creation with sound. That small revolution happened not because anybody organized that revolution or directed, or because there was an ideology, or because there was a call to start something, a movement, if we want to call it a movement instead of a revolution. But that worldwide, global movement, international movement, started without a clear triggering or a clear direction. And what happened during the 80s was that an entire culture was developed around cassettes. In fact, today it's called cassette culture, and or home music culture, home music network, different names to refer to this global, international movement and of course an underground movement for a number of reasons that developed itself using the format and the technology and the possibilities of the cassette tape. What is to me interesting about this movement, who basically included anybody who had the access to this technology, a very simple form of technology, and very relatively compared to the music production technology, tools, instruments, studios, equipment of the time. This was a gigantic leap in terms of lowering the cost and increasing the possibilities for doing independent work. And what happened naturally, in a social sense, is that an entire community developed, and that entire community was based on the idea of exchange of creation. So the cassette made possible a number of different things. One, the possibility of having a home studio, the possibility of creating your own music at home. And second, among other things, important, the possibility of exchanging those creations with other people by making copies of the cassettes, which was something relatively easy thing to do with the technology. So these things, these possibilities on a large scale, accessible to millions of people worldwide, generated this worldwide network of cassette culture, of people creating independently and exchanging independently, communicating that way. For me, probably what is most interesting about this is that this is one of many historical examples of showing that the situation that we live today in terms of communication, exchange, dispersed creation, interaction for creation, contact with other people in other parts of the world for creation, is not a consequence of the internet. The internet magnifies, amplifies, and speeds up the process of elements and causes and mechanisms, social, cultural mechanisms that are independent from the internet, that have not been caused historically by the internet or by the situation that the global communication system that we have today in place. And I said this, other examples. The history of the electric guitar is another example. Not technically, but techno-socially is another example of that. The invention of the development and the marketing of the first pocket cameras in the late 19th century, the Kodak pocket cameras for amateurs, is another historical example of the spread of a technology in a social sense, in a popular sense, for the creation with consequences, not only to create a market, global market, with access to this technology, which is clearly a purpose of marketing these things, of making them popular so we can make a lot of money by selling these things. That is clear. But the consequences of this, when a technology is accessible to a large number of people, the consequences affect a number of different things. And one of the things that they affect is the exchange of creation. And with that, they of course change the possible paths of, for example, aesthetics, styles of music, genres of music. Different types of music arose at different times in history, in recent history, because of the accessibility of different forms of technology. Not only because of that, but to a large extent very much influenced by this. And this is exactly what happened with this network on cassette, with this home music cassette culture network. And this this was my school. If I have to think of a school of a learning process, my learning process in music, in terms of aesthetics, in terms of the style of music, or the style of sound that I'm interested in, which I consider to be quite wide, and but also in terms of the techniques to do that, the technology to do that, techniques in this case with tapes. All of those things I learned by working with the technology and by exchanging with other people. So not only I exchange music, I also exchange knowledge on how to do things, and that changed my perspective on music. So this is my training. I don't have any other proper musical or technical proper training, but I've been doing this for a long time, so my training is a consequence of that process of learning through that technology. The two materializations of the cassette, or the two ways of implementing the cassette technology to create those virtual components of the creator as independent entity, where the so-called Porta Studio, the image on top, it was just a multi-track cassette recorder that allowed on cassette to record on several tracks and to do a number of other things, manipulations with the tape. And this became common in the late 80s, and by that time a lot of people were using this. Not only it was actually created and developed for a different market, for a market of popular music, so people could record different instruments in different tracks. They could create a demo tape, a demonstration tape, to send to record labels in the hopes of signing a record contract or something like that, which is the normal procedure in the industry of popular music. That was this tool, this implementation of the cassette technology, was taken by a lot of independent people who had other ideas or other goals in the use of the technology. But that basically became the studio, the home studio. And the double tape deck at the bottom, was basically the manufacturing plant, the home-based manufacturing plant for copying, for making copies of the cassettes. And therefore, instantly, almost virtually instantly, a number of cassette labels appeared. And hundreds, if not thousands of cassette labels, probably thousands of cassette labels worldwide, and of course all of them based on one or two people somewhere in a city, including of course Poland at the time. In fact, I had a lot of cassettes changed with people in Poland at the time, in the 80s. And so these two implementations of technology made possible for people to have their own sort of equivalent of a production company. And the idea, overwhelmingly, the idea, even although some people try to sell these things, sell the cassettes, for example, using the principles and the ideas of the normal market system, was basically to exchange the music, to exchange with other people, and exchanging cassettes, of course, over the post system. So a very slow process compared to the speed of exchange of information today, but nonetheless, a process that involved quickly, when you get into this network, quickly you will have so much music coming into your post box, your mailbox, that you wouldn't have enough time to listen to everything if you really wanted to listen to all these things, or enough time to collaborate with a number of people who were sending the music and exchanging the music. So in other words, the flow of information for listening, for exploration, or for work, for cooperation, was big enough to, even at that pace, to fill up your needs and beyond, or your expectations and beyond. I guess that depends on the level of anxiety and the level of production of different people. But anyway, that is enough to overwhelm a lot of people, even at that pace. Of course, today we have the collapse of all these different manifestations, all these different tools, all these different machines into the universal machine, the computer, as the universal machine for everything. So today, of course, we have all the equivalent of all of these different processes: creation, recording, production, communications, change, promotion, marketing, and everything collapsed into a single element that is connected to the network, the computer. And but one more time, once again, my observation is that we had equivalent, of course, with the huge differences that exist between, and that we can easily imagine, between the possibilities of a computer and the possibilities of the software that we have today to do a number of things with recordings and sounds, and the older technology. With the obvious differences, we have equivalent situations, and of course multiplied and magnified. Another thing that happened in this process that is also crucial is that in the process of having so many people using this common technology and actually using it and exchanging and producing, what happened also slowly, step by step, now today not so slowly, is a change not only in the aesthetics, in the styles of music. There's also a change in the rights of conception in society about who has the right to create. And today the ideas on who has a right to create are very different ideas to the ideas 30 years ago. So this is also a very important element that is normally overlooked. The right to create, the right to exchange, and the right to claim that what I do is worth attention, if I can get the attention. But the situation in terms of rights today is radically different. Today is we of course, with all the differences and with all the mechanisms that are in place with the market, obvious, today it is gigantically much more possible for a much larger number of people to claim that right and to some extent to implement, to carry on with that right of communication. And today what we have is a different kind of struggle, a different kind of problem. The problem is not so much the right, at least it's not what it used to be, to the scale that it used to be. The problem is attention with the amount of information, with the overflow of information sometimes. So that's a different problem that we have to deal with today. But in terms of rights, today we are living in a very different situation. When I started doing this work with sound, that for most people wouldn't be classified as music. And today there's also this question, this eternal question: what is music, what is not music? Is this noise or is sound, is not music? And that question, we can also discuss that. That one of the important reasons to discuss that is the political. There's a very important component, a political component of that question, which applies directly to your possibilities, more or less possibilities of doing what you want to do. So when the definition of what we do is one thing or another, is music or is not music, when that definition has political consequences, and it's almost every single time you, in a cultural realm, you're talking about definition of things, it will have, sooner or later, political consequences that will ultimately affect you as a creator in your possibilities for executing, your possibilities for carrying on with your work. So that's why those things are actually relevant to be discussed. Maybe not at a personal level. I might not personally care if what I do is music or not. And personally, I don't really care. But at a social level, in terms of the consequences of that label, for me to be able to do or not be able to do certain things, I do care. And the same thing for other people. So that situation 30 years ago, 20 years ago even, it was very different. Very, very different. You couldn't do a number of things. You couldn't present your work. And this, besides the more directly political situations in different countries, obviously with a very clear division between the case of Europe to Eastern and Western Europe, very, very clear division in terms of rights and in terms of communication and in terms of access to culture, very, very clear. Besides that, on top of that, also in the Western world, we had this other situation of what we considered to be, or what was socially considered to be acceptable. And not in terms of maybe acceptable at a theoretical level, but not acceptable at the level of being able to present your work. So tomorrow, for example, I have the opportunity to do a concert here. And this was very, very difficult back then, very difficult, if not impossible. And certainly impossible for me in my environment, in my country, for many years. So all of these things have to do with our mix, are intertwined in a very strong sense with the technology, with the cultural aspect of the accessibility and the use of the technology, that cassette technology. Another interesting observation we can also make is that there was also a time, there was also a very short period of time when CDs were the machines to record CDs were accessible, not when CDs appeared. The first time CDs appeared commercially, during a period of maybe 5, almost 10 years, it was not possible to record CDs at home. We could buy CDs commercially, but not to record them. That, of course, soon changed. And, of course, today we can burn CDs. Well, of course, now, today, we don't even care about burning CDs. But during the time that people cared about doing that, there was also another brief development of CDR labels, of labels that were independent, small scale, and we using this technology before the speed of communication for exchanging audio files was fast enough to exchange as we do today. So every single time in history that whatever the technology is accessible to a large number of people, and this goes back to the beginning of time, of course, in human history, there's always consequences, and the social consequences of how society changes a number of things. Things like not only the use of technology, or your preference for a type of technology, but changes in aesthetics. The entire community of people doing underground music, so-called underground music, since those times of the cassettes and into today, of course, has changed a number of important things, I think. And now we're starting to see these things in the history books of experimental music, electronic music, contemporary music. They're starting to show up now in those books, which is always a sign of, okay, we are putting some attention to some. The volume of things, the volume of change is significant to appear even in those more official, more academic books. So that is starting to happen now. In my opinion, too late, and in my opinion, too little. So I think there's a need for a recognition, not in particular artists, there's a need of recognition of a cultural and social revolution of a scale that has never happened in the history of music before. And I think there's very little recognition of that. You have to think of one important aspect of this. In my view, what is happening today, and it started happening, as I mentioned, a few decades ago, is that there has never been in the history of humankind so many people with access to certain type of technology, and this certain type of technology is equivalent, is basically the same technology. It's the software that we use, for example, today. It's with variations between different brands, different programs. It does the same things. It does very similar things. This doesn't mean that software doesn't go. Of course, there's software development. But think about the number of people that use the equivalent software for creation in sound, in video. And there has never been so many people at the same time using the same technology, the same tools for creation. And there has never been so many people that had such a fast access to this technology. We start using creative technology almost immediately. We have a process of learning with any piece of software, but we can start, and people do start, creating things, not just learning, but creating things almost instantly. So if we all have the same technology, and we are a lot of people with this technology, and the access is instant, what is happening today, in my view, is that the tool, with capital letters, in a very conceptual, philosophical sense, the tools for creation are becoming invisible, transparent. They're becoming as transparent as the switches for the lights, or as the faucet for the water, in the sense that the things that happen normally, we only realize when they don't work, but normally we have them and they're running. This, in my view, is happening with technology. And in that sense, in that particular philosophical sense, technology is becoming irrelevant. It's becoming, of course, very relevant because it becomes part of us, but it's becoming irrelevant in their presence and in their political aesthetic presence. So I don't share the view that we are, of course we live with technology. We always lived with technology. But technology, especially creative technology, is becoming transparent. And I think this is good news, because I think this moment in history, that has no precedent in history, not only because of the number of people, but because of the coincidence in the tools and the accessibility to the tools, it's a moment of truth, in my view. It's a moment of truth because now we don't have 10 years of piano lessons in between us and the appreciation or the execution of the music. And those things, of course, are still there, and there's nothing bad about them, But besides all of those things that require all that time and practice and rules and procedures on learning process, besides that, we also have in place a different situation that has on a massive scale. And this situation never happened before. And because of that, I think today, much more clearly than ever before in history, we can see the creative spirit of people, all the creative skills, the creative capability, the creative substance, whatever you want to call it, much better, much more clearly, much more transparent than ever before. And also, a little bit more food for thought, compare that to the history of literature, and then you will have an idea of the situation that we're living today. I guess this is my first big idea that I wanted to transmit to you, and perhaps I can do a little break with an example of creation of that time that I did with this cassette technology, and I did a long time ago. So of course, very simple means of production, very rudimentary ways of recording things, and therefore very interesting situation. The years that I spent doing this with these limitations, my main limitation was actually economic. I couldn't afford the better technology of the time. I couldn't afford a better recording equipment or a studio. Those things were extremely expensive at the time, and they're still expensive today, but today we have cheaper versions of that, and I think the difference in price has remained more or less constant between what is called professional or even bigger today and what is called sort of like not so professional amateur equipment. But the difference in resolution, quality, whatever you want to call it, between the professional and the amateur today has shrunk to almost equivalent. And this, again, hasn't happened before in the history of technology. It has happened for different examples, but it has happened on a massive scale in this realm, not only of sound, also of course of video, photography, etc. In the creative realm in general. So that situation that we live today is basically an equivalent situation. We can all produce things with, and today basically with the same quality, although quality is a matter of discussion as well. But anyway, so with those limitations, I think came a very intensive process of learning. So my years of just dealing with cassettes and with the limitations of the possibilities of the cassettes, not only for recording, but also for manipulating sound, I learned a lot of things, and I learned how to extract from that technology the more I could extract. And I think that's a very important process of learning, because then from the limitations you learn, you develop your own tricks and your own things, your own techniques, and also you, certainly in the case of sound, you develop a massive detail, experience and quality of listening and hearing. And that, of course, in the case of sound, I think is crucial. So anyway, that all of those things happen because of these limitations. So here's an example of, among many possible examples of recording that I did at the time. And I had a lot of trouble releasing, basically impossible to release this at the time, because you have to keep in mind that this is a time, late 70s, early 80s, where experimental music was basically synthesizers, rhythm boxes, things like that. So still, within that realm, so-called electronic music, experimental music, it was still followed a lot of the parameters of music, rhythm, and melodies sometimes. And so even within that environment, you will find yourself in trouble when trying to for example, present or perform your work. I was not the only one with that trouble, of course. Something. Another example I have here, it's also short. It's a collaboration that I did at the time with a number of people that when I did the collaboration that I have never met before. This also was a very common thing to happen in this cassette network of exchange and collaboration, collaborating with people, sometimes for years, with somebody that you will never meet in person. In fact, some of the people that I started collaborating with at the time, I still haven't met. Of course, now I've met a lot of people. I do a lot of traveling, and over the years I've met a lot of people. But still, a few I've been collaborating with. We have done records together, and we have never met. So my point with that is, I guess a number of different things. But one is that, of course, that was already happening at a very large scale as a common practice, actually, for a lot of people during the cassette network. And here's an example of a collaboration that I did with 10 other people. That way, exchanging cassettes in the mail, and then creating something, and then in the end, I made a composition from those materials. In this particular case, it was something that I asked for materials, we exchanged back and forth, and eventually I produced a record based on this exchange with 10 other people. two short examples of work of the time. In fact, this last example, that's an album that was originally released on CD and then released on cassette only in Poland in the early 90s, I believe. We have two options now. I can continue with a completely different set of ideas, or we can do a break. We can have some questions if you want. We can have some discussion about these ideas that I presented so far. So it's really up to you. So if you have any questions or comments or interest in discussing any of these ideas so far, I'll be very happy to. If you want to listen to something else, I'll be also very happy to play something else for you.
So maybe I have questions.
Yes.
Because you talk a lot about the techniques of recordings, the nowadays techniques, the techniques in the beginning of 80s. And I would like to ask you how the development of the technology affects the way you're working. Because as you said, you were sending the tapes, and now you can just drop something on Dropbox in a few minutes, and it's easier now. And also, if you go somewhere to record some stuff, nowadays you don't have to take with you yourself huge equipment, but you can just have a mobile phone, for example. So how it affects the way you're working?
In terms of the in many ways, I suppose. One way is that I can actually do some of that work. In the past, I wouldn't be able to do certain recordings, for example. So, specifically the technology for recording sound, today it's very cheap. There's tools for equipment for recording sound with very good quality today for almost nothing, for very, very little money. And that has changed the possibilities in a number of ways. One of them, for example, is I can have different recorders. So it is something that was impossible before. So I can, and this is something that I do now. I do a lot of recordings in nature, for example. And then and this is the second part of the idea I have for this presentation, about recording in nature and reality. And I can, for example, distribute a number of recorders in a forest. I can have several recorders at different places in a forest recording, because they're cheap, because they're small, and because of the autonomy of these recordings now. So today it's possible to do something with that type of equipment that was impossible in the past, which is to record even more than real time. You can record much more than your lifetime, than your existence time. And that has advantages and disadvantages, but it gives different possibilities and different ideas of what it is to do something like a recording sound. And this is something that was impossible in the past. It is also impossible to work with a recording equipment that is very expensive, is very valuable, to do certain things, like leaving the recording equipment somewhere. Because if you lose it, if it's destroyed by rain or whatever, then it's not an option. So another consequence of the miniaturization of technology for cameras and for recorders of sound as well, is that you can record. You're not obviously recording every single time that you're recording. So not only that you want to record, you want to hide your recorder, but you can actually record in many different environments because it's very quick, it's very immediate, and because you have it with you, you can have it with you. So you can record all kinds of things. It's a very immediate way of interacting if you are interested in doing that, spontaneously recording, which is something impossible when you have to set up a tripod, equipment, cables, connect, and do all of those things that are traditionally done with more professional equipment. And it's very conspicuous, it's very obvious. It will change everything. It changes the behavior of people, it changes the behavior of animals, it changes the behavior of everything that happens around you when you record in that way. So there's a number of things that are actually impossible to record with that kind of technology, that are possible to record today because of the cost and because of the size of the technology. Same thing that happens with cameras, and of course with cell phones turning into all of these different tools in one piece. Of course you can do all of these different things at once. But also because I think this is social, again, that changes a lot of things. When you have the contact with other people, you have the interaction with so much creation with other people, then that changes a lot of things and socially speaking, and that affects yourself. So I suppose it has affected my work in the sense of being able to do a number of things that were technically impossible, and being able to interact with a number of other people that have the same technology. In fact, the recording technology that I use, millions of other people have it. And my studio is this computer here, and as it is for a lot of people today. So we share that. That's another thing. We're talking about recording, if you talk about production, creation, transformation of sound. Today it's possible to do professional work with a normal computer, with a standard computer. And this is what a lot of people are doing today. So in that sense, it has changed the possibility for me to produce a professional finish, finalized master for production. And that includes not only audio production, it could be for film. I work rarely, but I work in film, and I can produce like the professional final thing they need in a professional film to use the sound, and I can do it with this computer. And also, of course, I can exchange with other people directly using the same computer. So that has changed a lot of things in terms of the possibilities. Also in terms of the pace. So your pace is different because you need less time for some things that were more time consuming before. So that brings up this whole question of the production, of the productivity of different people when you can do something that quickly. Some people are opposed to that, or some people regret that technologies, now everybody has a cell phone, everybody has a camera, everybody has a computer, so everybody's doing something. And so people regret the situation or complain about it, or they say, well, everything is shit. Most of the things that people do are like just noise. We don't like it, it's just too much noise. And some other people complain that because there's so many things you cannot, this creates a lot of confusion. But I think this is the price we have to pay for, which is a very small price in my view, to have a lot of people with the right of doing things. I think this is a very good situation, even if we have to cope with those difficulties, those problems. But I think, of course, it's undeniable that everyone in principle has a right to do it. And I think it's very good that we live in a techno-cultural situation where that happens to a large extent. Not fully, but to a large extent that happens. So I'm happy that that is happening. So in all of those different senses, the change in technology has affected my work.
I have a question. You were talking about the overwhelming amount of sounds and basically creation out there. The first question is like, how do you handle it all? How do you filter the entire stream of information that comes to you? And the second question that comes to my mind is, do you miss anything in tape production you cannot achieve nowadays?
Right. Well, the second question, probably the time that it took to some extent, it was probably positive, or it is a positive thing when we have slower processes of work for creation, for transformation of sound, for example, because you have more time for reflection, more time for comparing things, more time for taking decisions. That has a positive side to it, and I suppose that is something that I wouldn't like to go back to that situation, but that was certainly something that was there, very present. I do remember the pace of things, and I do remember the pace of comparing things to take decisions. More specifically, when and also because of the number of possibilities. When you don't have so many possibilities as we have today, your choices were different, and the way you were making the choices was different. Maybe more reasonable, more determined, more thoughtful, perhaps sometimes. So that was something, I think, positive in that situation. And we can work, I suppose we can work with strategies today. I think it's a self-contained, we need strategies of self-containment today. And some people actually are applying, to some degree, strategies of self-containment, self-restraint. Self-restraint for taking less photographs, self-restraint for taking more time for certain things. And to answer your first question, self-restraint for deciding that we have access to all this information and necessarily we don't have enough time for all of it. It's impossible, it's physically impossible. So one of the ways of dealing with it is to check out many things superficially, which is what is happening predominantly. This happens predominantly also in schools. It happens predominantly in education today. And I think we need to balance the amount of different types of information that we check out, that we are curious about, with the degree of reflection and the degree of depth into the experience, not only in learning, but also in the experience of that information that we have, especially for the types of information that are experiential. And a lot of information related to creation in art is mostly experiential. And it is more experiential in the case of sound, art made with sound, than it is in the realm of visual arts. But I think self-restraint also in terms of deciding that we cannot, of course, know everything, and also we give up in terms of checking many things. So instead of doing that, I'm going to select a few things that I find attractive, or that randomly came my way, and then I'm going to dedicate my time to those things. And then we need self-restraint to say, okay, I'm going to dedicate enough time to the same, even if I know that I will be missing a number of other things because I don't have enough time, because it's impossible. So I think any strategy there's a lot of strategies today that are implemented in software, in programs, and in networks to save you time. To save you time and make it possible for you, like multitasking, for the idea today of multitasking and of snippets of things. So messages are shorter, pieces of information are smaller and faster, and then you can do several things at the same time with a smaller piece of information. This is a natural trend. I'm not surprised by this. I don't think it's crazy. I think it's natural, but it's dangerous. And I think we need strategies of self-restraint in that sense. So we need to fight against that trend, which is one of the strategies of that is implemented in the global system for not a conspiracy, but is implemented naturally, technologically, for communication and for checking out different things. So attention span is reduced dramatically, but also the speed of presentation of facts it's quite impressive. The speed of narrative. If you compare, for example, the narrative, not only films, not only action films, where it's evident, but if you compare a documentary, for example, nature documentary today, and the way it was in the 60s, or the 70s, or the 50s, you will see dramatic changes, not only in quality of the film, you will see dramatic changes in the narrative, in the pace of narrative, and in the density of information per time unit. And you will see dramatic changes in that. And so I think probably we need strategies of self-restraint. And in other words, we need to choose, we need to accept that dedication for a few things is probably, for whoever wants to choose that option, is probably an interesting option in the face of the overflow of information and of the decrease of attention span. So I think it's this question, this whole struggle in that sense of self-restraint. So I think self-restraint has become probably very, very prominent today as compared to the situation. In the past, we didn't think, we wanted more, and we wanted access to information. And then when we have the avalanche of information, then now I have too much information. So what do I do now? Any other questions or comments? Okay, should we continue then? Or should we make a break? Let's make a 5-minute break, and then we'll continue. We can prepare a couple of things. Well, this is a fragment from a long recording of rainforest in Borneo, in Malaysia, that I did recently. And it has to do with the second main component of my work, that has to do with, I'm also a biologist, and I've been working in research in biology for many years. And in parallel, those two lives of biology and field work and sound work have always been unfolding and developing in parallel. And this is an image, I didn't do that crocodile, but this is an image from a workshop that I've been organizing in the Amazon in Brazil for a number of years, a workshop on sound and natural environments. And also you have another image there on the right with a little recorder that is hanging that tree with a tripod, and which is, I think, a good example of the recording technology that I'm using today. That is a model of recorder that as simple as the ones here on the table and as cheap as those. And this is basically the technology that I use today for recording. In my case, my experience of natural environments have had a very strong impact in the work that I do with sound. So exceptional, of course, recordings like the one that we just heard is an exceptional case of a very rich environment. There was a natural recording of an environment with many different sounds at the same time. And the rainforest in particular is a very special environment because of the diversity, but also because of the intensity of the different sounds, and also because of the way this happens. In the rainforest, you don't see most of the causes of the sounds. So it's a natural acousmatic environment. It's an environment that naturally conceals the sources of the sounds. So you hear a lot of things, but you don't see so many things. It's hard to see things in such an environment, as it happens in many natural environments, not only in the rainforest. So the sonic experience of reality tends, in many cases, to be counter what we normally expect of reality in terms of hearing sounds and then identifying the sources of the sounds. This is something that in nature it happens and it unfolds in a different way that our normal daily experience in no nature. And this for me has had a very strong impact because I spent years working in the field in those environments, and because of the slow seeping of this influence, of the richness of the textures, and also the sense of space through sound that you get in this environment. So I think that have had a very strong influence in the work, in the way I conceive not only the recordings that I do, but the way I conceive what it is to compose or to create with sound. For example, the scale of dynamics in nature is, of course, much wider than what we have in normal music production or music making. And the pace of things, the unfolding of things, the overlapping, the crossfade between different events in nature is also very different. And it's not always peaceful. This idea of nature being peaceful is one of the romantic ideas about nature. Nature sometimes is peaceful, and many other times is not. And sometimes it's quiet, and many other times it's not. So it has all this complexity, all this variety, and all this incredible range of dynamics, of frequencies, of events, and all of these different things are, of course, naturally, obviously, very different to the realm of music. But when the influence of these things, of this scale, of all these phenomena come into the realm of music, then things change in the way we conceived what it is to create music. So I think these are sort of random images from different trips, from different travels. I spent my life for the past number of years traveling and doing recordings in many different places. Sometimes exotic places, sometimes not so exotic places, to do recordings and to explore sonic reality. So I feel very lucky that I can do, of course, that kind of exploration, but I have to sort of actively create that luck somehow. And this is basically what I do today. So I do lots of recordings, and then I work with those recordings. I don't use any instruments to generate sounds, either traditional or electronic instruments. And I like the idea that the world at large, the world in general, exotic or non-exotic, it's the best instrument that I can imagine, the best imaginable instrument for music making. Not only in terms of what the actual recordings can provide, but in terms of the influence of this world, in terms of the influence that I get from this world. So I listen a lot. Besides doing recordings, I also do a lot of listening in different environments, and not just recordings. I'm not obsessed with recordings in that sense. And one of the main paradox in this activity with recordings for me is that I'm actually not interested in what normally most people doing recordings or taking photographs are interested in, which is basically, in a general sense, in a wide sense, representation or reenactment of reality, or simulation or replication of reality. I'm not interested in that personally. That is something that happens naturally. So when we have photographs, for example, and it's the prototypical example, photographs as representation. we have the immediate reaction to photographs or video or film. It's an audio of natural, quote-unquote, natural things, is representation. We see things represented. We can imagine those places, or we imagine something of those places. And so that happens for all extractions of reality. Of course, besides representation, we have many other possibilities. And the other possibilities that we have in the extractions of reality that we can take are of a different nature. And of course, this has happened in the history of visual extractions of reality much longer and much stronger than in the history of sound. In the history of photography, which is a very interesting history for anybody interested in sound recording, very early on in the history of photography, there was this question of whether or not photography is an art, and to what extent photography is representing reality, to what extent photography replaces painting or not. Those discussions started to happen early in the early 19th century or mid-19th century. And equivalent, so there's been a long time of discussion, and there's still a long, heated and developed discussion, and people thinking about it and writing about it in the history of photography. There is basically no equivalent in the history of sound recording, although sound recording is already around 130 years old, from the first invention of technology for recording sound. And there hasn't been an equivalent discussion, an equivalent thinking of what it is to record sound, or so-called real sounds, to the extent that it has happened in the history of photography, for example, or even film. And so, in other words, and this is something that to me happened not theoretically, but happened naturally, in an intuitive way, from the beginning of my experience with recording. When I started doing recordings with cassettes, with Walkman cassettes, very simple technology, of course, what you hear in the recording is different to what you have in the actual places, what you remember for the actual places. And but I also heard, besides that difference, I also heard something else. I heard in the recordings a world that doesn't exist in reality and that is interesting and rich and different. So in other words, to me what is interesting about recording sound, as it is with capturing images with whatever system that we have, is what is not there originally, what we have new, that has been created by the media that we're using to collect some extractions of reality. Normally, when people talk about recordings, and particularly in the case of natural recordings, recordings that haven't been transformed, or so we say, we have this prototypical reaction, which is, well, this is a very nice recording, it's a very nice photograph, it's a very nice thing that comes from reality, but of course it's not the same thing. It's not the same thing than being there. Being there is the full experience. Well, yes, to the extent of representation. But as we all know very well, there's many things we can see in a photograph that we couldn't see when we were there because we don't have the level of attention, we don't have the time, we don't have the... There's many factors when we are in the place that influence our perception of reality. Now, the usual critique of the machines that we have for extractions of reality, photo cameras, recorders, video cameras, is that they are deficient in the way they capture reality. They capture something of reality, but of course, what they do is deficient. It's not as good as our experience. And I think this is a way of looking at these machines that it's perhaps not the best, not the most interesting way of contemplating the machines. What photo cameras or sound recorders do is something that we cannot do for many different reasons. One, that it has to do not with perception. All the machines that we have for capturing reality, they have their limitations, of course. They have the limits of perception. They have the range of perception. In the case of microphones, they have, all microphones have a certain range, and they have a certain coloration of sound. They have specificities on how do they hear things. And same thing for the cameras in general. And they have those limitations. Within those limitations, within their range of perception, and within whatever specificities they have, they do something very special that we cannot do. They don't think when they perceive reality. And this is something we cannot do. All these machines are non-cognitive machines. When they see, when they hear reality, metaphorically speaking, they don't think. And therefore, they don't focus their attention. We frame the picture, we place the microphone, but within that frame, within that location, and within the range of perception, all these machines, they are not thinking while they're doing what they're doing, while they're capturing that reality, while they're gathering something of reality. So they do this amazing thing that we cannot do, which is not thinking while they do that. So in other words, this is very special, it's very peculiar, because they become sort of, by doing that, naturally, that's the way they operate, they become Zen machines. They don't make an interpretation of reality, and within their range of perception, within their frame of perception, they do this thing neutrally in that sense. And we cannot do this. So every time we look at a picture, every time we hear a recording, we hear different things, we see different things, of course, because we cannot have that level of attention. It will be impossible, and it's of course not only impossible, but it's undesirable. We cannot do that, and we don't want to do that, really. So these machines are actually seeing things in reality that we can't see. So they are doing something beyond what we can do. And it's not a matter of resolution. It's not a matter of quality. It has nothing to do with that. It has to do with the fact that they don't think. So my point with these machines, and I think the most interesting thing to look at these machines as a sound recorder, for example, is a machine that we can cooperate with, because we have our own taste and our own memories, our own feelings, our own, all the things that we have. But we cannot, when we are in a place, we cannot do what they do. So my point is that the way I relate to a sound recorder or a camera is in a way of cooperation. And that cooperation has very little to do with representation. I am personally not interested in representation. Representation happens by defect. Representation happens naturally. But it doesn't have to be the only way. A lot of people today claim that, and to bring up this discussion in a normal realm of perception for most people is very difficult. It's very difficult to explain to normal people that when you take a photograph, normal people meaning anybody who is not interested in creating, in a creative look at the extractions of reality. Anybody who, when he's taking a photograph, wants representation. Overwhelmingly, most people, when they take a photograph, they want representation. This is what they're expecting from a photograph. And that's good and natural. But for some other people, beside that layer of representation, beyond that layer of representation, we have many other things. All of those other things, which are, by some people, will be described as the phenomenological aspects of reality. All the things that more commonly we will describe as the texture of an image, the quality of the image in terms of the color, or the quality of sound, the richness of sound, the details of the sound, all of those things that we have so small vocabulary, so few words to describe, because we always constantly use metaphor to describe those things, because we normally don't live in that realm. We have very little words to describe those things because normally we don't use those words, and we don't have that kind of experience normally. So most of our words are related to representation, actually. So this is what happens for me with sound as well. So even if I'm constantly recording sort of real things, I'm not interested in replicating those real things. And what I hear in the recording, and what I do with the recordings, whether or not I transform the recordings, it's other things besides representation. So I'm interested in the phenomenological layers of what we have in the images or in the sounds. I am not the only one in that realm, but there are not so many people compared to the number of people that would look at images in the other way, in the normal way. There's also a process that is happening today that increases the level of representational conception of media, which is communication. In order to communicate, in order to talk on the phone, in order to send images, in order to see our friends through the Skype, we need representation, obviously, and we have today much more representation than we ever had in the history of humankind, and in density, in intensity, and in diversity of representation, constantly. And for most people, representation, the need of representation to recognize a voice, to recognize a face, has become paramount. And today we have such levels of representation constantly that we don't care about resolution anymore, for example. And resolution, like the old concept of quality of an image, of quality of sound, is much more irrelevant today than it was in the past. Resolution today is in the hands of the spectacle. So we have resolution, high resolution for IMAX theaters, we have resolution for big things, big shows, big spectacles. On our daily life, for our daily needs, of communication and of exchange of information, we need representation, not so much resolution. And we can cope with low resolution, no problem, as long as we have representation. So this is a reinforcement. In other words, there was, from the beginning of the existence of these machines, of the invention of recording machines, we have this question of representation. This question has been increased over time, and today is massively reinforced because of this technological, techno-social situation we live in. So today it is much more difficult than before to explain to the average person that if you're recording sounds, you're actually not interested in replicating that. When you play back those sounds, you are not hearing that environment necessarily. You are not only hearing that environment, you might be hearing other things. And when you think about it, in fact today, very recently, some people are very critical of this idea of sounds in themselves. Sounds in themselves as anything in itself. Anything, any object, anything we perceive, anything that we have around us, including other people. We can also think of these objects in the world as considered as they are in themselves. This is basically the quest of phenomenology. So for whoever is interested in these deep questions with sound and with images, representation, and our interaction with reality, I will recommend any basic readings, or not so basic readings in phenomenology, because it's very clarifying. It's not an easy thing to do, but it's a very interesting thing to do, and it goes to the core of these questions, I believe. So it has become even more difficult to talk about these things and to present the idea that it's actually possible when we listen to a sound that we recognize to hear something else. In the same way that when we see an image that we can recognize as something real, we can see something else beyond the representation layer that we have in the image. And so this is what happens to me naturally. From the beginning, I remember that my first experience of recorded things was, okay, this is clearly different, but this is actually, to some extent, and in certain aspects, much more interesting than reality. So I think it has become to this point that, of course, I don't want to replace reality, whatever that is, but I have these two worlds in parallel. And this world, the more I don't use the media, recorders, cameras, the more you don't use them as representation, the less they are media, and the more they become something else. They become your companion in your interaction with reality. They stop being media, because they are not in between you and reality for representation. They are along with you in your interaction with reality. So in that sense, I consider all of these tools and all these machines not media, but they are something else that is closer to a cooperative instrument more than a media or a medium in between you and reality. So that's one of the massive consequences of not considering images or recordings as representations, as big as that. In terms of the work with sound, it also has many consequences. If I am not interested in representation, which is overwhelmingly what most society is demanding, and not only demanding but imposing on you, then your way of dealing with those things is different, because you can do, of course, whatever you want. And your rules of the game are completely different. So I am playing a completely different game, because when it comes to work with sound, that doesn't rely on that representation. So whether or not I transform, I process those sounds, as it happens with images, I am not playing a game of representation, and therefore I'm in a different, completely different world. And that world is also open to influence from reality. The influence of reality is not only representational. So if I feel density in reality, for example, if I have a feeling of density or complexity, that might translate into the music, into the sound being created, in a way that is not direct, in a way that is not representational. So those things are, to me, very profound, and my main conclusions at this stage, at my present stage, after many years of doing this, many years of recording, many years of listening to the recordings, many years of working with those recordings, and many years of then creating worlds of experience from those recordings, and non-representational worlds of experience. And that's basically the other fundamental aspect of my work that also affects to a number of people. This is irrelevant now. This is a diagram of the process of examples of process of creation in cooperation with other people. Now, with these recordings and with this world in itself of sound that I'm constantly dealing with, what I'm interested in doing is actually, my main interest is probably creating worlds of experience that are based only in sound. In the process of doing that, which is a performance, a concert. In the process of doing that, that's possibly one version of that. So in that process, there's another challenge that we have to face, which is the presentation, the live experience of music, which is the tradition of the stage. And without going into too detailed comments of this, this is something also important for me because it has affected the way I can present things and the way I struggle to present things. And the way I struggle to create an experience of sound, a self-contained experience of sound for people. In the tradition of the stage, if that is a stage on the left, what we have is that, of course, there is this distribution of audience and artist or musician on stage. Since the moment that electricity started to be used to amplify sound, something happened historically, which is by the use of speakers for whatever music, whatever instruments. Historically, what has happened is that two realms of experience have been put in place naturally because there is the realm of the stage, sound on stage for the musicians, where they follow through monitors, those red squares, and the realm of the audience, or the space, perceptive space for the audience. These two realms are logical and are natural because we have musicians on stage, because they have to be, we want to see the musicians and we contemplate the act of music making for most music. And then, therefore, we have these two realms, magnified and amplified. And because we have this division, we have a historical schizophrenic split of the person generating sound, the musician performing the instrument, and the person controlling the sound, which is typically the sound engineer, typically in a live performance in the back of the room with a mixing board and listening more or less what the audience is listening. At least is listening something that is not what is happening on stage. So we have these two realms that have created historically this split. Again, naturally, a natural consequence of the combination of amplification of music and the contemplation of the musicians on stage. This is all natural and good for most music, but my criticism of this situation is that it is not a necessary arrangement of the situation between audience and musician if we are not particularly interested in the aspect of contemplation of the musicians. And one of the things that has happened historically, recently, in the history of electronic and experimental music, is the transference, the uncritical transference of the musician of the past, the rock and roll musician, the pop musician, and of course from a older tradition of classical music and theater, and to somebody who is on stage with actions that are not necessarily performative, actions that are not clearly, we cannot clearly identify or decode. The prototypical example, of course, is a laptop or computer, but it could be many other things. Before laptop computers, there's been a lot of discussion about this recently, but I would like to point out that before laptops, we had years of people doing things on stage that were also impossible to decode, impossible to tell what is the difference between touching this button or this button, what will be the effect in the music, or little movements will create massive effects in the music. So this is not a consequence of the laptop. This existed before and exists today along with computers for performance. But also it has to do with the choices for what to do with this situation. Again, I don't think there's anything wrong with the situation. I think what is wrong is to impose the situation and to transfer this situation historically in an uncritical way. So, because I have no interest in that personally, in what I do, and because I personally think that it's a distraction to look at a person that is just behind a computer or behind a bunch of cables and gear. I think most people, I think it is possible to have gestures as a musician. I think it is possible to develop an interesting performance visually with those tools. But I think most people are not interested in what they're doing. And certainly they should think a bit more about that, I think. And because I think this is a distraction for the perception of that world of sound that I try to create, I refuse to and whenever I can, not always, whenever I can, I try to create a different rearrangement of the space. There are many different ways of doing this, and this is an example of that. That is a type of example, a category not the number of, those are speakers, represent speakers. So that doesn't mean that we need to have that number of speakers. That doesn't mean that we have to have that particular arrangement or that scale of arrangement. But this is a category of rearrangement of possible of the space. And this is what I've been doing for a number of years as well, rearranging within the possibilities of each particular space, within the possibilities of technological or technical possibilities of different spaces, rearranging the spaces to reconfigure and to create a different situation for the audience. As you can see in these images, these are examples in different spaces, different venues. What I normally do is a rearrangement of the space in which I have the audience sitting, sometimes laying down instead of sitting. That depends on the scale of the space, depends on the possibilities, in a way that they're not, we have no stage, but also we have a rearrangement of the orientation of the audience with typically in all these different examples with sound systems around the audience and the audience facing outwards and a central position for me to control the sound. And that central position is to be able to be with the audience, of course in a very particular position. Some people say, well, you're in the center, you're in the best position because the center is the best position. Well, that is only if you do what you do during a performance or when you use the principles of the systems like surround systems, like the 5.1 Dolby systems. There's it's called a sweet spot in the room. The central position in the room is the best if you are, again, doing representation. This is what happens with 5.1 systems. This is what happens with those systems, home cinema systems, that you are supposed to be in a certain position to hear things there. This is related again to representation. So the helicopters, when they move in the film from here to here, you hear them, or they'll go back or whatever. So you are sort of simulating those things. When you're not doing that necessarily, when the dynamics of the music, you are aware of the fact that you have a space, and the different spaces are very different in what they do with sound, then not necessarily the central position is the best position. And I have to keep this in mind, and I work in the performance with keeping this in mind. And the other thing that you can see appreciating these images is very different spaces, different scales. Every single sound system is different. I work with whatever is possible to work with. I don't have my system, I don't have a specific scale. So I adapt to different spaces, different materials, and different scales. The other thing that happens with this is that, which is also a key element of what I do, and I think what other people do as well, is the fact that sound does not exist in a recording or does not exist in a generation that we do with a machine for sound, in the tools, in the software, in the generators that we have for sound. Sound exists when it materializes, when it becomes physical in a space as an interaction of whatever amplification system we have and whatever physical system, space we have, interaction of sound system and space. And I don't think that you can just play whatever in whatever space and to be happy with it. In that sense, I don't have pieces for performances, but I work in site-specific with the space. And that is a consequence also of the experience of working in very different spaces, with very different reactions of the spaces. So this prototypical configuration, with a lot of variations, I try to use in different spaces, and I try to adapt to the proportions and to the materials and to the structure of the space to create an immersive experience in sound. I am interested in that immersive idea of sound that is created from abstractions from reality, and I'm interested in a virtual world made of sound, not in a replication of that original reality. In that sense, when, again, one more time, when replication is not the goal, simulation is not the goal, the flexibility in the ways that we arrange things for this virtuality of sound, it's endless, I suppose, and it depends on what is possible for us to do. So here are some other examples of sound systems, very unorthodox sound systems that don't rely on specific intentions for simulation. And so this, for example, is a sound system based on a design with speakers for car sound systems in domes and then hanging from the ceiling of the space. This is a system that already exists with those round speakers that you see, the red balls and other speakers in the room. But was developed in France. It's a much more professionally sophisticated system. I have also worked in planetariums, for example, with the systems they have in place, with the sound systems they have. sometimes with very large systems, like IMAX theater systems with hundreds of speakers. And those systems are designed for, with so many speakers, not for volume or for loudness of sound, but for resolution of sound. Of course, it is exceptional to be able to work with systems like this, and they're not necessarily the most desirable systems. There are systems that are designed for virtual movement of sound, again, for simulation. And every time I had an opportunity to use a system like this, I never used them for simulation. I think they're actually very poor simulators. They only work very well with simulation when you have images accompanying the simulation. And an image is the best way to fix a sound in terms of representation. Here's an example of another system that didn't exist, but I designed this structure. It's a double dome structure with almost 100 speakers in a big space, and with the idea of creating this immersive experience that is not a simulation of reality, but it's more hyper-reality. So this question of hyper-reality, that is one of the versions of how to deal with non-representation. It's also a common aspect of my work. From things like this, very sophisticated, very unique, and very exceptional systems, to very mundane and very common and very cheap systems as well. I'm interested in working with very simple technology, and this is an example of a sound installation that I did in a forest in France that took place at night only, so for one person at a time. So what you see here was not visible for the visitors. They could only have an indication of where to sit, and then they couldn't see those hanging things, which are boxes with speakers inside, speakers with batteries and with MP3 players. And those are the speakers, the type of speakers that are sold today for iPhones and computers, small portable speakers. And I've been working with these small portable speakers recently. This is another example of a type of small portable speaker that you can attach to windows, to glass. And I did this sound installation recently with these small speakers, very cheap and very simple in a big space. Other types of rotating speakers, also homemade structures. And also I've used speakers that are in place already, like PA systems, public addressing systems with speakers in the streets. This is a system in the street, in a square in Hanover, in Germany, that has speakers, public announcements. I use this for a sound installation. Or the speaker system in the subway in Madrid for another sound installation that took place in the subway stations. And of course, the quality and the type of response that you have with these speakers will be radically different. And one of the things that you learn when you work with such variety of systems is that what the most interesting thing to do, in my opinion, is to compose for those systems. I think it's a mistake to have a recording or to create something and then that you try to replicate or project using whatever system. I think you need to adapt and to be consistent to the system in terms of composition, in terms of creation. And I think the most interesting creation with so many different media we have today, so many different projection systems that we have today for sound and for images, is to work specifically with the specificities of the medium in particular. And when you do that, any speaker is the best speaker in the world. It doesn't matter what speaker, how big, how small, it doesn't matter. It's just a matter of working for the specificities of the media. And the other component that I value a lot and that I try to implement as much as I can is the situation for the audience, the situation for the spectator, for the listener. And there, whenever I have the opportunity, I go to great lengths in trying to facilitate that experience. In the case of listening, I do most of my performances and sound installations and other experiences with sound in the dark. And I try to promote an immersive experience, listening experience. So this is an exceptional case where I could do that with recliners, with these things that were extremely comfortable. They were even more comfortable than they look comfortable. They were amazingly comfortable. So you will basically forget. This will be actually, I think, even better than those flotation tanks. Maybe you have heard about these flotation tanks, sense deprivation tanks. These tanks that you go inside, you have water, you float in water with salts, and you lose the consciousness, they say, of your body. In my experience, I experienced that several times. It doesn't work very well. This worked better. And so I also combine, in this particular case, speakers and headphones at the same time, and which is also a very interesting realm. The realm of speakers and the realm of headphones are two different realms, not only because one happens in space and also happens without space, but because of many other reasons. And one of them has to do with detail, for example. So all of these elements combined And I've also worked with immersion, literal immersion, with concerts underwater, which is a completely different environment, and completely different rules of acoustics and sound dispersion and everything else. So all of these variety of experiences have to do with my desire to create that world, self-contained world of sound. The last element in this quest for the what I consider to be a token of freedom for the spectator is the paradoxical use of a blindfold. I've been using blindfolds for the audience for a number of years, providing blindfolds for the audience. And the reason for this has to do with my belief of the amount of freedom that this will convey as when it's voluntarily accepted to the listener. And perhaps we can get, let's see if this is going to work, an explanation, 1 minute explanation of what I do from this gentleman here.
אומן מוזר לחלוטין, לא יודע אם הוא אומן או די-ג'יי, מדובר באדם שמושיל את הקהל, משמיע להם מוזיקה אלקטרונית, אבל כולם צריכים להיות עם כיסוי עיניים, המוזיקה הייחודית. בואו נראה קטע קטן מהמופע של פרנסיסקו לופז בשבת בישראל. הנה. יכול להיות שזה נראה כמו חקירת שב"כ או כמו איזה משהו מטלטל במיוחד, אבל זה היה מופע פשוט מדהים, ממש מופע מיוחד מאוד. יושבים יותר מ100 אנשים במרתף חשוך, עיניהם מכוסות, והאיש הזה, פרנסיסקו לופס, שהוא אומן ספרדי, שהוא גם ביולוג וגם אומן של מוזיקה אלקטרונית, מביא מוזיקה מרחבי העולם, מיערות גשומים, מאנטארקטיקה, מקליט אותם, ממקסס אותם, והקהל מאזין, וזה להיט. וזו חוויה של שעה, זה קשה להאמין שזו חוויה מאוד מרגשת גם, זאת אומרת, אני מנסה לא להיות ציני, אבל זה מאוד מאוד מרגש, מומלץ, הוא יחזור בקרוב, אם אתם מגיעים ואתם לא חוששים שבאמצע ידרשו לכם איזה מידע סודי, מומלץ מאוד, פרנסיסקו לופז, לזכור את השם הזה.
So you have the explanation of what I do. I actually think it's a very good explanation, a very good description. Because it has to do with the experience, it has to do with the voluntary acceptance of experience. And these situations, I insist, because of the way they look, of course, obviously in the photograph, these people are not kidnapped, they're voluntarily accepted to do that, and the use of the blindfold is voluntary. So I see these more as a game, as a collective game or a collective ritual. And in my experience with doing this, I started doing this almost by accident, because I wanted to have a dark space, and you cannot have a dark space in most conditions. It's very difficult to get a real dark space. Pitch black is almost impossible. Very few conditions, a very particular situation will allow that. Besides the fact that I am in the room with the audience, I'm in the center of this audience, so I have equipment, I have lights and equipment. So the blindfold came as a simple, practical solution. But then, over the years, it mutated into something else. It mutated into that, what I consider to be a ritual, and also mutated into commitment. One of the aspects of this, I think, is that when you want to do something like that, you voluntarily accept this something else besides listening better. When you don't see, you listen better, you hear better, that's obvious. Besides that, there's the commitment in the acceptance of the game or the ritual, the commitment to listen. And then I always make it very clear that this is an optional thing and it's a voluntary thing. And in my experience, for most people, overwhelmingly, it's a very positive thing to do, and it changes dramatically. It changes not only because it's not equivalent to closing your eyes, there's a much more forceful action and commitment to the listening experience that comes with that. And that's why I keep doing this whenever possible in different situations, and still doing it. And I will do it tomorrow, if they let me do it, which I think is part of the plan. And to finish this section of the presentation, I wanted to mention perhaps an extension of the practice with blindfolds, which I've been carrying on in an exceptional work for me, which is working with musicians, with ensembles, with instruments. And I've been working on several compositions for blindfolded musicians, who perform the pieces not randomly. They don't improvise and they don't play randomly. They have a specific, in the end, when we have the composition, there are specific things they have to do. And they do all these things blindfolded, so there are, of course, no score, no visual cues. And also, we have the cues in the music itself. So you need to listen to the music as you are performing with other musicians, along with other musicians. following these cues in the music itself. So you have to listen to, of course, what happens. This happens normally in music, but without the visual cues, without the score. And this, to me, is an ongoing process that I find also extremely interesting in the discovery of the action of not seeing when working with sound and with music. So as you can see, an obsession with not seeing, voluntary, and an obsession that doesn't refuse the visual, but reinforces or reaffirms what we can have through the auditory only. I think when we work only with sound, we discover, as it happens with any other sense deprivation always creates a reinforcement and a magnification of the other senses. This is natural, physiological, and in the process of doing that, we discover a number of things. So synesthetic things, like synesthesia, like we trigger a lot of different things. One of my experiences with audiences in the performances in the dark, with blindfolds, is the natural, instantaneous triggering of many different things that are very personal, and memories and emotions and many other things. And to me, this is a wonderful aspect of the openness of the work with sound, and also is a wonderful result of that situation. When I bring the attention of the listener or the spectator away from what I'm doing visually, whatever it is that I'm doing, into a very personal inner world. Naturally that happens, and it naturally has a lot of consequences that for me are very interesting consequences. So to finish this section, let me play an example among many possible examples of a transformation of those elements of reality, a fragment from a piece, a composition that's made entirely from natural, real recordings turn into something else, which is a common practice for me. If you have any questions or comments or desire for a discussion, we have time for that. Yes.
Yeah, I'm pretty curious about the process when you design your sound for different sound systems. For example, how it differs between designing for dynamics or for the pool or for PA systems or for the sound hole. You can share with me.
Mm-hmm. Well, the key question is how much time or you can spend with the system in order to create the sound. So I wouldn't use any monitors to any other reference to create the sound, to take the decisions of the types of sounds, equalization, combinations, mix, with any other monitoring system that is not the system itself. So for example, when I created that installation with the small speakers, the pocket speakers, I only worked with those speakers during the compositional process. So I didn't use any other monitors or headphones or anything. And all my references were within those speakers. And so that affects not only to the, let's say, the more technical aspects of how you equalize the sound for those particular speakers, but also affects your decisions in terms of composition. For example, some things that at that scale of reproduction or projection of sound, and within that range of frequency of sound, will lead you to decide that you want to have more time of this particular material or less time. This is, of course, personal decision. Within the personal choices, within those choices, for every single person, will be definitely there will be consequences in your composition that you will take differently than if you're using a different system. So that is as simple as that. And that will affect, that's one thing. The other thing is, as I said, how much time you have with the system. With bigger systems, normally you have very little time because it's very expensive and whatever the system that plays is very expensive or it's very complicated, so you will have less time. So for me, it's very crucial to fight for time and to, within whatever is possible, to fight for time. Because then, if you are working not only with the system, but also with the space, the peculiarities of the space. Now, another thing is, some systems are very good for example, virtually placing sound or moving sound, apparently, and some others are much worse than that. And some combinations of space system and space, sound system and space, are very good for that, and some others are not. So the same sound system in a different space will be less efficient in those things. So you need to have both things and then take the decisions, the compositional, or what for other people will be, for some people that will be the mix. People with a DJ mentality or work will be more the mix, and how the mix is transformed. I mentioned that mix because you might not have enough time for composition in the space, but maybe you have time for combining different things or tweaking, tuning different things. And then your decisions, not only in terms of the equalization, which is the most typical thing, but in terms of how much of this do I use, or do I use this or not in this space. And this I do normally when I do performances, prototypically. So for me, what comes before a performance is not only a sound check, it's a pre-compositional, excuse me, a pre-compositional time. So when I'm in the space with sound system, my decisions of what to use, I test a number of things and I decide, well, this I don't like how it sounds in this place, I'm not going to use this. Even if there's a material that I like very much. So those are examples of decisions that are affected by the sound system. Any other questions? Well, and I think, excuse me, we're probably done with this. If you want to hear something else, I can do a little listening session for whoever wants to stay for the session. And, or if you have private questions later, or questions just in private, I'd be happy also to answer any other questions. And so again, tomorrow I have a performance in the festival, in case you don't know about that. I don't know exactly the time, but it's in the program. And if you accept the game, you will be voluntarily blindfolded for that performance tomorrow. So let me finish with some some clocks. And an example of a combination of a number of different things that I mentioned, which is working with real sounds, so-called real sounds, and recombining those real sounds without processing. So this is an example which is common for a lot of people, for a lot of the practice of a lot of different people composing with sound without not so much manipulating the sounds, but recombining the sounds in different configurations that don't happen in reality. So what you're gonna hear now is an example of a piece I made in a project recording only clocks. I did this project in the Netherlands, and I recorded from clock towers to very small watches and clocks. And my process was a process of creating imaginary combinations of all these mechanisms. Most of them actually in what you're gonna hear in this fragment, from very small mechanisms for the cogs and the wheels in the small clocks.